Studying together. We have been studying from a series on how to study the Bible, and we'll plan to pick that up next time, Lord willing. In the meantime, in reference to that study, I'd ask you if you have a question, something particularly you'd like to hear dealt with in that regard, just drop a note in the box back there. If you have a question particularly or subject relating to Bible study, and we'll do our best to incorporate that and to make sure that we do get that, pay attention to those questions. Appreciate them very much. This morning, I'd like to share a lesson with you that likely is not new in terms of the material, and yet it's one that I do hope and plead all of us will take personally and thoughtfully. There's a word that I hear on a regular basis. You may as well in just the general discussion. You'll hear people of the world talk about culture, about team culture. If you just take an English dictionary, the word culture in this context is defined as the set of shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterize an institution or an organization. The set of shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterizes an institution or an organization. Where do you hear this word? I hear it quite a bit in reference to sports. And this is not to get us off on an unimportant subject, but you'll talk all the time. You hear about sports teams, and they have a good culture. They don't have a good culture. I didn't watch the game. It was yesterday, I think it was, where I heard somebody talking about one of the teams, one of the football teams. The quarterback decided he wouldn't play the second half. Maybe that was worked out ahead of time. I don't know. I don't really care. But, it didn't look very good. That starting quarterback decided he wouldn't play the second half because he didn't want to take a chance on getting hurt. He thinks he's got big pro potential. And then there was another scene where a couple of players were fighting on the sideline, don't know what happened, don't really care. But somebody was talking about how that's not a very good looking culture on a team. Well, that doesn't look very good, does it? And then on the other hand, the old live and die for high school, hometown high. There are some people who sacrifice and get out there and play on a broken bone, because they don't let their teammates down. Two entirely different pictures. I'm not saying that's all that smart. I don't know if sports are that important, but the idea couldn't be more, the contrast couldn't be more obvious. Whether you have a team culture where people care about each other and they have a common goal and they are lifting each other up in a situation where everybody seems to be out for themselves. And everybody's complaining and everybody's pointing fingers. That can happen on a sports team. And usually when you have a bad culture on a sports team, it's not going to work, no matter how talented the people are. There's a team, again, talking about football as an example, that was expected to be the best in their conference. They won 2 games this year. Everybody said they had a bad culture. I don't know, maybe they did. Something went wrong. But I know if you don't have a good culture, you won't have a good team. The first time trouble comes, the whole thing will fall apart, no matter how good it looks from the outside. And I'm talking to people, some of you guys have coached, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You played on teams. In business, I heard, again, just coincidentally over the last month or so, watching a little YouTube video, before you go to bed, and it was about some family business. Different ones, maybe some deli up in New York. Family owned, been there for 3 generations. But what struck me about the little story was that not only did the family work there, but they had employees who had been there for 40 years. And I think surely they could have found another job in 40 years. Why would they stay? I think because they felt like they belonged there. And when you walk up to the counter at a place like that and somebody who's been there for 40 years, you don't have to beg them and wave a flag to get them to take your order. Have you been to a place like that? Where you walk in and obviously nobody cares. And you have to beg them to wait on you. And who knows what you'll get after you order. And if you come back, a month from now, likely you won't see anybody that you saw before. And if you wait long enough, you'll probably see a for sale sign in front of the business. Businesses have a culture, and it can be a good culture, it can be a bad culture. Families can have a culture. And here are people that are related to one another, and we talk about this as a tight-knit family. It doesn't mean they don't have problems, but it means that they care about each other, and then you have other situations that are very sad. Where you have folks that don't talk to each other and they have no relation with each other. Culture. And when it comes to the church, local churches have a culture. And we know that to be so. If you look over in Revelation chapter 3, you can read there about messages that Christ sent to the churches, 7 of the churches of Asia. And when it came to the church at Philadelphia, you remember the message was verse 8, I know thy works. Behold, I have set before thee an open door, and no man can shut it. For thou hast a little strength, and hast kept my word, and hast not denied my name. Behold, I will make them of the synagogue of Satan, which say they are Jews and are not, but do lie. Behold, I will make them come and worship at thy feet, and to know that I have loved thee, because thou hast kept the word of my patience. I also will keep thee from the hour of temptation, which shall come upon all the world to try them that dwell upon the earth. Behold, I come quickly. Hold that fast which thou hast, that no man take thy crown. Him that overcometh, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall no more go out. I will write upon him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, which is New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from God. And I will write upon him my new name. You have here this great picture of this church, a little church in some sense, and yet holding to God, holding to one another, holding to the work. There's a culture at a place like Philadelphia that was so different than a place like Laodicea. We understand that. And there's great power when it comes to a congregation that has a good culture. The point of the lesson is simply this. What kind of culture do we have at North Bibb? And if you're not from this congregation or of this congregation, we're glad you're here, but you certainly can think about this in reference where you are. What is our culture here? Do we look like that team that that had everybody pulling in different directions? Or do we look like rather something that is much more tight-knit, loving, purposeful? Number one, what is our culture here? And number two, what part do I have to play in that? That's really what I want to think with you about for a couple of minutes this morning. And we won't be able to say all we want to say about that, but I hope, my prayer to God sincerely is that every one of us, me included, as we leave this building today, will be reminded of the importance of these questions. Let me start out by making the point that there is power in a church that has a strong culture. It has power to affect the lives of every member of that congregation. I love Ephesians 4 here. This is from a modern speech translation, the New English translation. 4:15 reads, "But practicing the truth in love, we will in all things grow up into Christ, who is the head. From him, the whole body grows, fitted and held together through every supporting ligament. As each one does its part, the body builds itself up in love." All glory and credit goes to Christ. But through the power that Christ gives, a church is a body. We're his body. And every ligament, every joint has something to supply in order to help the whole. Let me tell you, if you're here this morning, one of your ligaments is not working, you notice. It hurts everything. But everybody has a part, a role to play, and every member is blessed when we're in that kind of environment. That's what a local church is designed to be, edifying to the whole. I'll tell you something else we know. That is that in a church with a strong culture, we make an impact outside these walls to others. Acts 17 is not necessarily the happiest picture. Paul and Silas have come to Thessalonica, and they have made inroads, and a church has been started there. But of course, they started at the synagogues, talking to the Jews, who should have been the ones to see first the gospel, because the gospel is the story of the Old Testament. The gospel is coming. Anyway, not everybody wanted it. So, verse 5 reads, "But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd." Verse 6 reads, "And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city officials and shouted, 'These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. And Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus.' And when the people and the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things." Well, you know, we don't go out of our way to try to offend people. But I have to tell you, when I read this, I'm a little bit envious because they were noticed. There's a train of thought, we've talked about this before, but there's a train of thought among folks, maybe some good folks, who think, well, maybe putting Church of Christ out there on the building and letting people know the Church of Christ meets here might be too offensive. Because Church of Christ can be a loaded term to some people. We don't want to offend people. And I just think whatever good intentions are there, that just is so misguided. Obviously, I'm not suggesting there's only one moniker for the church. But it's a scriptural name. And I've not found, frankly, in my experience, as you go and talk to people in the world, that our big problem is that if we tell them we are the church that belongs to Christ or the Church of Christ, that'll just shut down a study. You know what I find? People don't have any idea what that is. They don't know the difference between, as I've said before, between the Church of God and the Church of Christ, and church is chicken. They don't know anything about it because we haven't been maybe talking about it enough. I always felt like, and I'm sure you probably can relate to this, my biggest fear should not be making somebody upset. I don't want to do that. I certainly want to do what I can to avoid being offensive. But my biggest hurt is not that we have an encounter and they leave mad at me. My biggest hurt is we have an encounter and they think that I agree with them when we're done. And I've not done a good enough job of making it plain what the truth is and what needs to be done. That's a much bigger problem. I have to say that the gospel here in Thessalonica got people's attention. There were lies told about it. There always will be. But here is a culture of preaching and teaching and living that was so distinctive that the world noticed. Glory! And those who want it will receive it, and those who don't will find a reason to hate you for it. But a strong church culture will get attention. God help us to do a better job. Let me share just briefly, some good characteristics, and some is a key word there. We're not giving a complete list of a good church culture. You know, one thing that's obviously a part of this is that there have to be common values. There has to be a fellowship that's based on common belief. Acts chapter 2, they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, in fellowship, in breaking of bread, and in prayers. Of course they did. They believed together. That's what held them together, a common understanding. In Ephesians chapter 4, this is a great chapter on unity, isn't it? Walk worthy of the vocation wherewith you were called, with all lowliness, meekness, long-suffering, forbearing one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. Amen. But we also need to emphasize the next verse. For there is one body, one Spirit, even as you're called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all, through all, and in you all. We read this verse, we remember that unity is based on a unity of belief. And that's not to say that there are not going to be folks in any group that are at different levels of understanding and maturity. Obviously, that's going to be so. But let me tell you, we are strong as the church because we believe the truth together. I wonder how many congregations there are with that Church of Christ on the front door. And you have in that group, in that number, people who do not believe there's just one baptism. They're not so sure that it matters whether you're baptized or not. They're not sure if there's one faith or not. I mean, well, you know, maybe folks over here in this other group, maybe they're saved too. There's not a concrete belief, a foundation. There's got to be an understanding of what we believe and why we believe it among every member. And that's what will make a strong culture. And when it's not there, you know, Galatians 1, Paul said, what in the world? How is this possible? That you've been moved off of the gospel, you've been taught to something else? That's a problem. Doctrine's a problem. 1 John chapter 2, we won't get into that today. But anyway, that's where he talks about how there have been some who left us. They left us because they really were not of us. If they'd been of us, they'd have stayed with us. But he says in that same context, you have an unction of the Lord. That's a great subject in and of itself. I'm not sure that that's miraculous there, by the way. That anointing he's talking about there may be simply the teaching they've received. And that you are where you are because you've been taught the gospel. Why would you be moved off of that? Why would you forget that? Why would you go back? Or go off in some other direction? That's certainly the point he makes in 2 John 9. In 2 John 9, he makes it plain there, whosoever transgresses and abides not in the doctrine of Christ. And I think that's the doctrine that Christ gives us. I don't think that's just about Christ. The doctrine of Christ hath not God. He that abides in the doctrine of Christ, he hath both the Father and the Son. So we've all got room to grow. But a church has a good culture when they know what they believe and why. And it's our job as teachers and as students to make sure we know what we believe and why we believe it. What does this church stand for doctrinally? And am I in the right place? I think that it's important likewise for a local church, if it has a good culture, it has a culture that expects to sacrifice for the cause. Matthew chapter 10 is one of those places, and there are many of them, where the Lord challenged those who would follow Him with words like this. Verse 24, it's the same thing, isn't it? He said, if they've called me the devil, what are they going to do to you? The disciple's not above his Lord. And then in verse 34, do not think that I came to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. I came to set a man at variance against his father, the daughter against the mother, the daughter-in-law against the mother-in-law. What does he mean by that? You know what he means by that. He means when you take your stand for me, there are people that are not going to like it, even in your own family, even very close to you. I'll tell you what he says to you. He says, you better choose me. And he doesn't even bat an eye when he says it. You better choose me and put me first. When you have a church culture that comes to Christ not expecting it to be, what does the old song say, flowery beds of ease, but expects to pay a price, then you have the proper culture. Luke 14, this great crowd comes to Jesus. And the Lord says, oh, I'm so glad you all are here. We've got a record number. That's not what he said, was it? What he said when he looked at that crowd, knowing that there were so many there who didn't know why they were there, or they were there for the wrong reason. And so this is what he said. Here's his Dale Carnegie moment. He said, if any man come to me and hate not his father, his mother, his wife, his children, his brethren, his sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. Well, Lord, you shouldn't have been that hard. We're not going to correct the Lord, are we? Jesus loved those people. He died on the cross for them. We know that. This is not malice. It's a wake-up call to say, if you follow me, you must take up your cross. I'm talking to me as much as anybody in this room. It's easy to fall into that idea that Christianity is doing what's right till it gets hard. It's not. It's doing what's right, whatever it costs. When you have a church full of folks who believe that, you got a strong culture. That believe what they preach. That goes hand in glove with what we've been talking about, isn't it? I love that 2 Corinthians chapter 4 is such a great exhortation to us. You know, Paul is writing and telling them that to him it's all about Christ, and it's all about the work, it's all about the message of the gospel. He said, we have that treasure, but we're not the treasure. We're just the clay pot the treasure's in. And so we're expendable in that sense. And that's why he says we suffer. And we suffer gladly. We're troubled on every side, yet not distressed. Perplexed, maybe, but not in despair. Persecuted, certainly, but not forsaken. Cast down, but not destroyed. Bearing about in the body the dying of Jesus, that the life of Jesus might be made manifest. We suffer like Christ did so we can share the message that Christ died for. And he says in verse 12, I think in part this should have shamed the Corinthians, certainly, some of them had turned away from Paul after all he had done for the cause and for them. But in verse 12 he wrote, so then death works in us, but life in you. And we're pleased with that. And I'll tell you why. Verse 13. We having the same spirit of faith according as it is written, I believe, therefore I have spoken. We also believe, therefore we speak. That's a quote from Psalm 116, which is a great psalm. But he borrows that expression, and what he seems to be saying here is, let me tell you why we do what we do. We're not crazy. We're not getting rich off of it in this world. The answer is obvious. We believe it. We believe it. And because we believe it, what else can we do? When you've got a church full of people who believe it, they believe in the message they're preaching. You know how these cults, some of them teach the most crazy nonsense. They're evil from the start. But you know how they have such great success? They have such great success because they get folks to believe what they're preaching. I can remember one of the first plane trips I made as a young teenager. I went to Chicago, went through Chicago. O'Hare Airport, biggest thing I'd ever seen. I thought Birmingham had an airport till I went to Chicago. And I said, we don't have an airport. We got a landing strip. But I can remember as a young man seeing the Moonies, the Unification Church. Anybody remember that? I think they're gone. I don't know. They still be around. You see them out selling flowers in the airports and so on. Barefooted, probably hadn't eaten in 3 weeks. So they could collect money to give it to some, devil somewhere, some cult leader somewhere. How in the world do you convince people to do that? Not for a loving Lord as we serve, but for a devil. Well, I don't know how you do it, but I'll tell you, once they're convinced, they'll do what is necessary. We don't want to be deceived. We don't want to be misused. But the one thing about that picture that I will admire is that there are people who believed in what they were saying. When Christians believe in what they're saying, then they'll be like Paul. Paul, we were just studying in Brother Chris's class, in adult class, from 2 Timothy. And here's Paul, and the last letter we have from him. And it's a letter that's just filled with faith. I wish everybody could be like me, Paul said. I would long for everyone to live as I've lived and die as I'm going to die. It's well with me. I have a reward that's waiting for me. That kind of spirit shows the kind of culture that we need. A culture where each member takes satisfaction in their role. And this is where we certainly cannot do justice to 1 Corinthians 12, but you know this passage. 1 Corinthians 12, if you'll turn over there quickly, is where Paul, writing to a divided church, reminds them we are the body of Christ. By one Spirit, verse 13, are we all baptized into one body. But we are not one member. We are many members of that one body. And in that body, just like a human body, you have the foot, you have the hand, you have the ear, you have the eye. Nobody would mistake an ear for a foot. And they have different functions, and they may be seen in different, but all of them are necessary, and all of them have a part to play. Do your job. And do so without envy, and do so without pride. Verse 25, that there should be no schism, the old translation says. That's just a transliteration, bringing a word from the original language over into our language. Schisma, a gap, a divide, a split. There's no room for that, he says, in the body. But that he says in verse 25 here that the members should have the same care one for another. If one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. If one member is honored, all the members rejoice with it. You are the body of Christ and the members in particular. What is my role here? We don't all have the same role. Some things we share, some we may not. But everybody in every congregation has a role to play. Everybody. What's my role? You know, Donna and I have the plan in the coming year to sit down and talk with every family here. And that's not a punishment, I hope. But it's more a matter of trying to make sure we're on the same page, to try to be the help that we can be, and also to try to encourage every member to be the help that they can be for the body as a whole. But it is essential that every member feel a responsibility. And you know good and well in congregations wherever you go, there's some that don't. There's some that don't. Don't let that be me. Don't let it be you. Every member takes satisfaction and joy in the role that they play. That every member seeks the common good, and that's the point that he made there. Let me quickly, in the last 3 minutes of the lesson, just mention some things that cause damage to a culture. Murmuring and complaining certainly can do that. Do not grumble, the ESV reads in James 5 and verse 9, against one another. I'm not saying that's a bad translation. That almost sounds too light. Grumbling. We grumble about taking the garbage out or something. I think it's quite a serious matter he's talking about here, isn't it? Because I'll tell you, grumbling doesn't stay just grumbling. If grumbling is allowed to go on, it leads to resentment, which leads to bitterness, which leads to hate. Several years ago, I was talking with a dear friend, preacher's kid, from days gone by, growing up in a preacher's household, and this lady was telling me about an experience that she had. They had moved to a place, there had been a lot of trouble in the work, and there was division and some bitter things. And in her presence, she was younger then, I don't know, she might have been a teenager. She heard one brother, or one Christian, might have been a sister, I don't know, it doesn't matter for our purposes, but one Christian say about another Christian, I hate them. And she said, I just turned pale when I heard that. And she hadn't grown up thinking like that. She had grown up in a household where she was taught to hate is to murder. To her, it would have been no different if one Christian had said to another, I want to murder you. That's the same thing to her, and the same thing to God, as far as I can tell. And she was telling me this story, but you can't help but think, how did that person get to that point? I'll tell you, it didn't happen overnight. It came through stages. Starts with grumbling, resentment, ill will, and it can build into something that will absolutely eat you alive. That'll just damage your church culture. Partiality will also, Timothy was given the charge, the solemn charge, to carry out these commands without prejudice, without favoritism of any kind. I heard an old coach one time who said, I don't treat all my players the same. He said, I treat them fairly. I think we can understand, we can relate to that as parents, because one thing that we know is that children are not the same. And so we can't treat all our children the same because they're not the same people, but we can treat them fairly. I think that's what being impartial is about. We treat each fairly. We take each case, but we don't care any less about one than the other. If you have in a congregation the feeling that some people don't matter, you're going to have the kind of trouble they had in Jerusalem in Acts 6 and verse 1. This is an old expression, let Henry do it. Anybody use that anymore? I heard that growing up. Let Henry do it. You can guess, if you haven't heard it, what that's about. It's about the spirit that is good at maybe seeing problems, but when it comes to solving them, let him do it. Somebody will do that. Somebody will handle that. I understand that not everybody's qualified to handle every problem, but needs are not somebody else's job. They ultimately involve me. What can I do to help? It's an entirely different view, isn't it? The person who is just good at pointing out, we're not doing right, we're not doing well, this is not good, this is not, and the person who says, here are things that need to be improved. How can I help that? Maybe I can't solve it, but I can help it. If you have that spirit of let Henry do it in a church, before long it's going to be in pieces. Apathy, maybe even worse. This fellow doesn't care about the problems, even enough to complain. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 11, again, a modern translation reads, do not lag in zeal, but be enthusiastic in spirit, serve the Lord. What was the great condemnation of the church at Laodicea? Whatever they were concerned about, it wasn't about what God cared about. He said, as far as I can tell, you're just lukewarm water. You make me want to vomit. That's as strong a language as you'll find. God forbid that he would see me in that light. I just don't really care. I'm just here for a minute. I don't really care what's going on. I don't care about improvement or problems or anything else. I just don't care. Not really. God forbid. If you have that in a congregation, you have weakness. And the more you have, the weaker the church is. A lack of discipline. Certainly is obvious. Paul wrote to the church and said, you cannot tolerate this gross immorality. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. When it came to Revelation chapter 2 and verse 20, the church at Thyatira, you have that woman Jezebel that teaches my servants to commit fornication, and you allow that to happen. A congregation has to exercise discipline. Titus chapter 1 is particularly speaking to the elders when it says that he must be devoted to the trustworthy message that agrees with what we teach. Again, we're on the same page in terms of our fundamental beliefs. So that he may be able to encourage others with healthy doctrine and refute those who oppose it. For there are many people who are rebellious, especially those who are converts from Judaism. They speak utter nonsense and deceive people. They must be silenced because they are the kind of people who ruin whole families by teaching what they should not teach in order to make money in a shameful way. It's important for a congregation to be on guard about what is taught. And that lack of discipline, or the lack of discipline in terms of the moral climate of a congregation, can destroy a work. So, exit is this. What kind of church should this church be? What kind of culture do we want here? And what am I doing to get us there? We've not covered a lot of new ground today, but I do hope that maybe, as Chris mentioned, at the end of this year and the prospects of a new year, we might think about what Wes can do, what every one of us can do to improve the culture of the congregation I'm a part of, to make it stronger, to make it more tight-knit, closer to God and closer to one another. God help us to that end. All right, we're going to sing a song, Hark the Gentle Voice. It's an opportunity for you to let us know if we can be of help to you, if we might help you to be baptized into Christ today. We'd rejoice with that. Or if we might help you to get back to God, maybe praying with you and for you, taking your confession, whatever it need be. We'd love to help you in any way, and let us know how we can do that right now while we stand, while we sing.